Hello, my beautiful watchers. Feels good to be back in the Lost in Adaptation threads. If you're new here, this is the show about comparing film adaptations of books to said books to see how loyal to the original plot and themes they stayed. For everyone else, are you mother lovers ready to get back to Narnia? Prince Caspian, published the 15th of October 1951, is the second written and fourth chronological book in the Chronicles of Narnia by English author C.S. Lewis. As mentioned in a past Lost in Adaptation covering the first book to film in this series, C.S. Lewis was a war veteran, patriot, personal friend of J.R.R. Tolkien, distinguished teacher, and huge fan of Jesus. Spoilers for later books in the series, but it's eventually revealed that the Chronicles of Narnia was secretly low-key Christian fanfiction all along. So yeah, let's quickly break down what happens in this particular installment of Fur Jesus and Friends. The story has barely begun, having just time to establish that, 1 year after falling out of the wardrobe, the young sibling heroes of the first book, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy Pevensie, are chilling at an English train station before they are gripped with a magical force and dragged without warning back to Narnia. They discover that things are a tad changed from what they remember as time in Narnia moves at its own pace in cheerful, no-fucks-given disregard to time on Earth. 1,300 years have passed in the single year they were gone, and the great castle they lived in is now a ruin. Fortunately, the magical gifts that they got from Father Christmas, save Susan's horn, are in an untouched secret chamber, so they can gear up. Not long later, they rescue a dwarf from two human soldiers who were attempting to execute him via drowning. His name turns out to be Trumpkin, former leader of the dwarf people who had recently lost re-election to his rival Biden-san. Sorry, I couldn't resist, but don't get me wrong, Trumpkin the dwarf is nice, he's cool, we're good. Trumpkin fills them in on what's been happening in Narnia since they've been gone. Apparently not long after they left, a hitherto unknown about race of humans invaded Narnia from a far-off land called Telmarine. Their leader, Caspian I, successfully conquered the land, subdued and vastly reduced the number of magical creatures there, and drove the spirits of the land and trees into hibernation. He then ruled as king until his death, and his family stayed in power for the next millennia. To fill the reader in while Trumpkin fills the kids in, the narrative switches for a good while to King Caspian's descendant, Caspian X, who is probably about 13 years old. He's got a pretty standard rightful king backstory, as his parents are dead and his kingdom is being ruled by his evil uncle Miraz, who, unbeknownst to him, was the one who killed his father. He seems like a nice enough lad, and his head is filled with stories his nurse tells him about the way that Narnia used to be when it was all magical and fun. When Miraz finds out about this, he has her sent away and hires a respectable tutor, Dr. Cornelius, to educate him instead. However, Dr. C almost immediately starts educating him about old Narnia as well, revealing that he himself is part dwarf. When Miraz becomes a father, he decides to off Caspian so his son can be prince instead. Fortunately, Cornelius helps the lad escape and gives him an ancient relic of the before times, Susan's horn, explaining it will summon help when he really needs it. Caspian rides off into the woods and immediately comes across a shit ton of old Narnian talking creatures who immediately hail him as the true king of Narnia and all team up to defeat his uncle. Yes, apparently it's their religious canon that Narnia should be ruled by a human, just obviously they would prefer it be a nice one. Caspian's top allies are the dwarfs Knickerbrick, who's kind of an arsehole, and Trumpkin, the badger truffle hunter, Cornelius, who catches up to him, and the leader of the fanatical warrior mice, Reapercheap. They wage guerrilla warfare against Uncle Douche-Nozzle, but suffer a lot of defeats. Eventually they decide to blow the horn, hoping to summon the High Kings of old, or better yet, Aslan. The kids were apparently sucked into Narnia by said horn. Trumpkin goes out to look for them and is captured, which brings everyone up to speed. The kids set out to join up with Caspian. Along the way, Lucy sees Aslan several times, but as no one else can, they don't really believe her at first, with the exception of Edmund, who is willing to take it on faith to try to make up for being a shithead in the first book. However, they do eventually meet up with his feline holiness, and he gives them all a power-up with his magic breath. He then charges the two boys to do all the stuff they were going to do anyway regarding helping Caspian, lets out a mighty roar that wakes up all of the spirits of the forest that have been sleeping for centuries, and sets off to do his own thing with Lucy and Susan. Peter and Edmund find Caspian just in time to hear Knickerbrick, who has teamed up with a werewolf and a hag, trying to talk the lad into doing some black magic to resurrect the White Witch and get her to help them. When he refuses, there's a fight, the good guys win, but Caspian is wounded by the werewolf. Knowing their side is badly outnumbered, Peter decides to try to handle things mano a mano and challenges Miraz to single combat. Caspian wants to do it himself but can't because of his injury, and Miraz is needled into accepting by two of his dukes who don't like him very much. Even though Peter is back to his former High King badassery, Miraz is still a grown-ass man, so it's a pretty close-call duel. Peter gets pretty convinced that he's a goner, but he holds his own until Miraz manages to fall flat on his face. Peter was going to let him get back up, but the aforementioned dukes run up, stab their own king in the back, then blame the Narnia Narnians for it, which works because apparently all Telmarines are legally blind, so both armies charge in to do battle. During all this, Aslan has taken Susan and Lucy for a ride not dissimilar to the one in the first novel, though instead of rounding up tide-turning reinforcements, they, Okay, this is a little hard to explain. First, he destroys a Telmarine bridge by summoning the Spirit of the River to tackle it, then he basically travels to all the Telmarine towns and villages doing miracles or just other weird magical things. He turns water into wine, heals the sick, rejuvenates an elderly lady, knocks down some schools, chases off some bad teachers, recruits some good teachers, and may or may not have turned a bunch of bratty schoolboys into pigs as punishment for being bratty. I guess he was converting the Telmarines to Aslananity, but I don't know, it just seems so weird on many levels. Back with the menfolk at the battle, things are touch and go for like a minute, but then all the newly awakened spirits and trees of Narnia charge in and overwhelm the enemy into surrender. Aslan finishes his Jesus tour of the country and meets up with the army, solving the issue of what to do with all the Telmarine prisoners by revealing that their kind predated even Telmarine and were originally from the same world as the Wonder Kids who just defeated them. Their ancestors had stumbled through a portal to Narnia, a bit like the wardrobe on a deserted island, but if they wanted to, he could summon a magic door and they could go back there because the island was pretty nice now. Like, one guy has the balls to take him up on this, but when he vanishes through the door, the others decide that Aslan is probably sending them through a portal to the Blender dimension and refuse to follow. Peter tells the others they're going to have to go through first and return home to England to prove it's safe, and that Aslan has mentioned that he and Susan can't come back to Narnia anymore because they've gotten too old, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the Telmarines have proven that humans can be born, live, and die in Narnia, but whatever, we do not question the word of Aslan. Minutes after getting back, Edmund realizes he's left his battery-powered torch in Narnia, and while I know this doesn't happen, I would have loved for that to have affected the technological development there. Next time they visit, it's a cyberpunk world, but everything's based on flashlight technology. I'm gonna level with you guys. I'm not saying I hated it, I still enjoyed this book overall, but I have always thought that the plot of Prince Caspian was significantly weaker than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Things like the way the kids got to Narnia and the villain they faced there seemed like a big step down in memorability. That said, I still found most of the story pretty engaging. I like the parts where the kids figured out that over 1,000 years have passed, and Caspian's backstory in particular. They hurt a bit for feeling a little rushed, but that's pretty standard for this chronicle. I mean, the entirety of the kids' reign in Narnia and their adjustment to getting back to Earth took up, what, 2 pages? Once everyone meets up, things go downhill a bit because the titular Caspian is suddenly reduced to being a side character to the original cast, and I cannot stress enough how weird Aslan's segments felt to me. It really didn't seem to serve much purpose beyond putting the fear of furry god into the civilian population. It certainly didn't do much to help with the battle. Said battle felt like a straight-up repeat of the preceding novel, with the outnumbered good guys getting saved by unexpected reinforcements. I guess every battle in Narnia is Helm's Deep. BT dubs, if you notice that the way that the Caspians took over Narnia is suspiciously similar to the Targaryen conquest of Westeros in the Song of Ice and Fire books, fear not, we have not stumbled upon some G to the R.R. Martin plagiarism. It's simply that both of these story elements are based on the real-life historical events of William the Conqueror's invasion of England from Normandy about 1,000 years ago. His people were originally from Scandinavia before taking over Normandy, and then after winning the Battle of Hastings, William became King of England. The current monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, is a direct descendant of his, along with roughly 25% of the British population, but that's less sexy. Again, I do want to stress that this is a good book overall, I just have more criticisms than when I read its predecessor. After the success of the adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in 2005, production started on the sequel almost immediately, partly due to the need to get this shit filmed before the cast aged too much. Still, these films take a ridiculously long time to complete, so it didn't hit theaters until May 2008. Disney stuck with the same director, Andrew Adamson, who, as I mentioned in the other episode, is something of a jack of all trades in the film world, with extensive credits in writing and producing, as well as the handful of directorial roles. All of the appropriate actors from the first film reprised their roles, including Liam Neeson as the voice of Aslan, and they even worked in a cheeky cameo from Tilda Swinton, much to my satisfaction. In addition to being reviewed well by critics, the film received moderate success at the box office, landing the number 10 spot in the highest grossing films of the year. I'm just going to throw this out there, there appears to be a bit of influence taken from the Lord of the Rings in this film, just a bit. It's subtle, but if you know what to look for. It's also an ungodly length again, and some of the performances from the less experienced actors still leave something to be desired. Aside from that though, it's honestly pretty solid. The special effects have held up, and they brought in a bunch of talent to play the supporting characters. Future Game of Thrones fan favourite Peter Dinklage was cast to play Trumpkin, and Warwick Davis was brought in to play Nickabrick, making him the only person to feature in both adaptations of the book, having played Reapercheap in the BBC production. This version of Reapercheap was voiced by stand-up comedy genius and gender-fluid icon Eddie Izzard.
Yeah! Choose your last words carefully, Talmarine.
Thank you for flying Church of England, cake or death.
And Ben Barnes got the role of Prince Caspian. Okay, yeah, you're probably going to be able to guess the first thing I'm going to mention in the What They Changed section, huh? Speaking of, maybe it's about time we talked adaptation. Okay, what do we have here? We have Caspian's backstory regarding his conqueror lineage, followed by his more recent history of being snuck out of his own castle by his tutor, Dr. Cornelius, to avoid being offed by his not very nice at all Uncle Miraz, and fortuitously immediately running into the downtrodden magical creatures of Narnia, who all decide to vote for him to be their new king.
You don't vote for kings?
Well, how'd you become king then?
Caspian giving Susan's horn a toot in the hopes that it will better his situation, resulting in the 4 fateful lads and lasses being dragged back to Narnsville without so much as a by your leave, finding their old digs not looking so homely anymore and picking up their stash of Xmas gifts. Susan saving Peter Dinklage kin from the Talmarine unfriendlies with a few well-placed arrows, Lucy being able to see Aslan before the other kids, and only Edmund being willing to take it on faith. Everyone joining forces and killing off the separatists in their army who want to throw in with the White Witch, Edmund delivering Peter's letter of challenge to Miraz, and them duking it out. Peter winning and trying to show mercy, but Miraz getting shanked by his own underlings, the battle that Peter was trying to avoid breaking out, but the baddies getting smashed by the discount Ents that Aslan got up and at him. Reapercheap getting all janked up, but saved by Lucy's potion of supreme healing, and Aslan restoring his tail after he was bummed out he lost his old one. Finding out the Talmarines were from Earth originally, and as deportation is apparently the easy solution to generations of colonization, Aslan giving them the option to go back there. The Talmarines being too wussy to walk through a magic door unless the kids who have just kicked their asses are willing to go through it first, which is kind of a bummer because Peter and Susan have just found out they've been banned from the club. And ending on Edmund hilariously realizing that he's left his sick new flashlight in Narnia. There were some details that I wasn't expecting them to stick to, but was impressed that they did. The first that springs to mind being Peter straight up decapitating a guy at the start of the battle. I mean, I know he slew monsters and junk before, but it seems way more visceral when it's just a guy, you know? The siblings nicknaming Trumpkin their dear little friend, then shortening it to DLF, though it comes at way less than in the book, which is probably for the best because, as Trumpkin Dinklage rightly points out, it's a little offensive. The kids' first encounter with a new, non-sapient animal of Narnia, where Susan hesitates to pop a cap in its ass for so long the bear almost eats Lucy, but she's saved by Trumpkin, who is more used to this way of things. There's mention that Aslan is bigger now, and he explains that he grows with the children. I was curious to know what the significance of this was, and the short answer turned out to be, when you draw close to Jesus, so does Jesus grow within you! So, yeah. Edmund is reasonably book accurate in that he really doesn't have all that much to do. He already completed his whole arc in the first story apparently, so now he's just there, not betraying people for Turkish delight. And they also left Lucy reasonably book accurate in behaviour and actions. So, Mr. Lewis, it's often been commented on that the character that you created, Aslan, is a rather obvious allegory for Jesus Christ, our Lord and Saviour. Now, could you elaborate a little on that? He's not an allegory. Come now, odd boy, it's rather explicit that he is. He's not an allegory for Jesus. He is Jesus! Oh my goodness. As you can see, there are some aging up shenanigans going on here. Lewis didn't straight up confirm anyone's ages in the main books, but he recorded enough info on his timeline of Narnia to get a pretty accurate fix on everyone, and Caspian was definitely around 13 in his first appearance. I can forgive them the necessity of adding a few years to each of the characters to account for how much the actors aged in the time it took to get production going, but Ben Barnes was 26 at the time of filming. everything he does in the story is now recontextualized from a kid doing his best to an adult who is really, really bad at his job. A sheltered 13-year-old boy letting his kingdom get usurped from under him and ending up completely dependent on someone else to win it back again is somewhat understandable, but now he's a grown-ass man letting a teenager from another universe fight his battles for him. There's a lot less build-up to Caspian using the horn in the film. In the book, he actually makes the old college try at winning the war himself, and it's not until his side has been beaten pretty bloody that he and all of his generals eventually discuss it and decide to give it a go. The steaming pile of wuss in the film was blowing that thing the very second he was in the slightest peril, the same night he escaped the castle. He also gets way more tempted and drawn into Nickabrick's terrible resurrect the most powerful evil being to ever have endangered Narnia plan. The lad of the book rejected the idea outright because he had more than 3 brain cells. Instead of trying to utilize an extended flashback halfway through the story, which let's face it was pretty clumsy even in the book, the film condensed a lot of Caspian's sections so it could run in conjunction with the Pevensies. This is a fairly common adaptation choice, as at least having the facade of chronological storytelling is much more the expected norm in movies. It also dedicates some of its ungodly runtime to establishing the kid's behavior on planet Earth, showing Peter's aggressive arsehole tendencies and Edmund being cooler because he's willing to have his brothers back on general principle. This adaptation falls into the same trap as its predecessor, giving into the temptation to add some extra personal drama into the story, and I think it falls into it much harder, probably to compensate for the relatively weaker story. I already mentioned this in the episode regarding The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, but it bears repeating that the kids of the book are all pretty much defined by a single character trait: the perfect knight, the redeemed one, the true believer, and Susan. Lewis made it super clear how little you're supposed to get attached to these kids when he started cycling them out going forward. But this works because the main characters were never the focus of the Chronicles of Narnia. Narnia itself was. The leads were two-dimensional blank slates to allow the children experiencing the story to project themselves into whichever one they felt the most connected to. The most affected by the decision to give them a little more depth was Peter, and they evidently decided that what he really needed to make him more interesting was for him to be a complete fecking mess. I have mixed feelings about this. I didn't find him acting like an ass to everyone throughout the entire film very endearing, but I do appreciate that they at least put some thought into how they were going to justify it. Lewis kind of sidesteps the implication of what it must have been like for the kids to try to return to their old lives in the body of children after having ruled as kings and queens for decades in another world. I personally got the impression there must have been some sort of magical memory adjustment going on to avoid the psychological damage, which would also explain why the Pevensies appeared to have completely forgotten about their lives before Narnia when they went hunting for the white stag, but it all came flooding back to them the second they fell out of the wardrobe. The film tapped into a rich vein of drama by simply asking, okay, but what if they did get messed up by it? What if Peter in particular were having trouble readjusting to life as an irrelevant teen, because what greater early peak could there be than leading an army, saving the world, and ruling as High King, and then even the thing that he thought he wanted, returning to Narnia, didn't make him feel the way he did before, and he dealt with it poorly. As a result, he's constantly venting his feelings through fights and arguments, trying to exert control over everything and everyone, including Caspian, making brash, bad decisions that he doubles down on again and again due to hubris, then blames other people for, and constantly pushes his loved ones away. He does, of course, overcome it by the end and symbolically lets go of the past, but it's just a little jarring how at odds it is to his original book character. In contrast to the author's seeming complete disinterest in the character, the filmmakers actually let Susan do stuff, even taking part in the fighting, which would have given C.S. Battles Are Ugly When Women Fight to Lewis a heart attack, which is pretty cool, but they also jammed in a very forced and awkward romantic subplot between her and Caspian, which is not. As well as being completely unnecessary, it's also heinously executed. They exchange virtually zero dialogue with each other, so we're to assume their occasional lingering looks are what led to them suddenly being a thing 2/3 of the way in. Now that I think about it, her pre-Narnia setup involves her cold shouldering a dweeby-looking guy trying to hit on her, so I guess her entire arc was boys. Alright, let's talk about the Telmarines. Despite no mention of it in the book, the filmmakers decided to give them a recognizable aesthetic to accentuate that they were foreign invaders of Narnia. Now, you would think, as they were such obvious allegories for the Normans, that it would be highly logical to assign them a notably French look, but for whatever reason, they decided to go hard on Spanish instead, specifically taking a lot of influence from the 16th century conquistadors who invaded and colonized Mexico and parts of South America. This struck me as an unfortunate choice for several reasons. First, only 3 of the 8 core cast members portraying the Talmarines are Hispanic, and Ben Barnes certainly wasn't one of them. And secondly, while both of these historical groups were famous for being invaders, there's kind of a big difference between one medieval European noble defeating another medieval European noble on the other side of a channel and the genocidal colonization of the 16th century. I mean, the worst that happened to the Saxons of England was the nobles had to learn French and cut back on the slavery a bit because Will didn't care for it. Within 100 years or so, the invaders and the locals were living in reasonable harmony. When the old Narnians become allegories for the victims of the conquistadors, the native people of the Americas, the part where they all unanimously agree that the one white guy in their midst is indeed supposed to rule them by divine appointed right takes on a much more problematic implication. I don't know, either they didn't think it through or I'm overthinking it. We now come to a general change that I think was a contributing factor in almost all of the others. There's a recognizable effort to put a more adult, darker spin on the story. They did this a little in the last film, but it's recognizably more pronounced here. Don't get me wrong, Lewis never shied away from mentioning there were casualties in war, but this film really leaned hard into showing every violent on-screen death and heroic sacrifice. Miraz straight up forces his general to kill his own men as punishment for failing and to spread propaganda about old Narnians. One assumes the writers were aiming for this to be the Empire Strikes Back of the Narnia films, but it just seems odd to me, to be honest. The borderline nonsensical whimsy of old-school fairy tales was kind of the fundamental core of these books, and trying to ground them in gritty reality seems awkward and forced. Dr. Cornelius gets the shaft a bit, as he's apparently dumb enough to stick around and get arrested by Miraz now, forcing Caspian to have to rescue him later. While Aslan has all of the majesty of his written counterpart thanks to the power of some book-accurate dialogue and the commanding tones of Liam Neeson, the approach they took to his integration into the story is quite different, because while they kept to the part about only Lucy being able to see him when he tried to give them directions, they chose to hold off on his full reveal until much later in the story. What was originally his first meeting with all the kids is demoted to a dream sequence only experienced by Lucy, and his amusing trolling of Trumpkin is shifted to after the main events of the story. Instead of the old Narnians being gathered by a helpful if somewhat hyperactive squirrel, they appear to have been summoned from all over by Susan Horn. Evidently it's the red phone from the Powerpuff Girls now. The single greatest addition to the plot is a failed infiltration and assault on the Talmarine capital's castle. It's buggered up by a combination of Caspian going off plan and it being a really bad plan in the first place. It wasn't a poorly executed addition, but it was a tad predictable. Even though this wasn't in the book, I think I saw where it was going faster than the parts that were. Peter needed to be served some humble pie to learn a lesson from, and they needed a third act breakup to add tension to the story. Amusingly, an attack on the castle was considered but dismissed in the book. Peter actually straight up wins the fight in the film, having Miraz at his mercy, but giving Caspian the option to execute him or not, which of course he doesn't because good of heart and whatnot. The Narnians apparently took the time to set up a bunch of traps for the Talmarine army, so I guess they were fully expecting it to come to battle in this version. The bridge is made more important in the film, as Miraz makes a big deal about needing it finished to progress with his invasion, and after the tide of battle turns, the Talmarines attempt to regroup there and defend it, making Aslan's destruction of it tactically useful instead of a random act of vandalism. The effect is somewhat lessened when you can clearly see that just about anyone could easily wade across this stream, but, you know, they tried.
I'm drowning! Oh God, I'm drowning! What the? Oh.
So, is the White Witch also a trans-dimensional figure from Christianity? No, she's just a Oh dear! Shockingly, the Aslan miracle tour across Narnia I described was deemed too weird and blatantly religious for darker, edgier Prince Caspian. The book established that Caspian was super into the idea of old Narnia when he was a wee nipper, but it proved to be a mistake to try to talk about it with his uncle as he got shut down hard. He got the info from his kindly nurse who was banished for it and replaced with Dr. C, though of course his new tutor was even more into teaching him about this stuff, so that plan backfired hard. He's reunited with his nurse at the end when she turns out to be the woman that Fur Jesus saved from her deathbed. Let's see, what else? Oh yes, Lewis's fixation on describing food continued into this book, as did the filmmaker's decision to skip over it. We also lost Susan schooling Trumpkin on the awesome combative skills of English children in an archery contest, the part where everyone knights everyone else after the battle, and Aslan's courage restoring but probably very moist cat breath, which was almost certainly quietly nixed because it would have looked very silly. Final thoughts. While there's a lot to take issue with here, this adaptation was still better than I expected. Not great, not terrible, solid C grade. The fact that a lot of it comes off as a not as compelling rehash of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is in fact true to the book, so it works in its favour. I sympathise with the dilemma they faced regarding Peter. Even if they hadn't made the conscious decision to try to adult up the story, they would still be under a lot of pressure to add character arcs to these kids because, let's face it, it might be significantly worse to try to match the level of intentional blandness that Lewis was going for in his cast. His ability to make his stories engaging while simultaneously remaining very simplistic was something of a unique skill, and I recognize this is a somewhat subjective opinion, but I think that blank slate fan surrogate characters are one of those things that can work well in a written medium, but not so well in films. I also think they pushed a little too hard for a darker, edgier Narnia. I can't argue with the results. The film's financial success showed it was a wise move to try to appeal to a wider audience than just young kids, but they did lose a lot of the heart and soul of the book because of it. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. Before we part ways once again, I hope you will forgive me for reminding you that Aslan might be all-powerful in Narnia, but here on YouTube, the algorithm is the god we have to appease, and nothing does that better than plenty of likes, shares, and comments. If you're new here and have enjoyed yourself, please consider subscribing for more content, and if you really enjoyed yourself, give that bell a click so you can be the first to view future episodes. Please take care of yourselves out there, and I will see you soon.
He is the fearless leader. She is the true believer. No longer such a wiener. Susan's also there, I guess. Jesus, lions, and fantasy violence to save Narnia. The Pevensey kids talking mice and Turkish delights. It's metaphorical. The Pevensey kids.
Much love and appreciation to my patrons of honor, Shelby Hote, Satel Spurtloff, and Kat Harker. Shout out to Ilnej for performing this awesome tune. Check out his channel for more parody and original songs, and a huge thank you to this video's co-producer, Kate Robinson. She does some really amazing work on her channel that I think you would really enjoy, so be sure to check that out too. And Trumpkin, the badger mushrooms. The British way is always the better way. Prince Capulet, sexy like the Queen. Oh, Lizzie. You're gonna put that in the bloopers, aren't you?